In 1975, Nigerian political scientist Peter Ekeh published a seminal article titled Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa, a theoretical statement, in the Journal of Comparative Studies in Society and History. In this work, Ekeh introduced the concept of the two publics to explain the prevalence of corruption in African public service. He argues that colonialism created a dichotomy between the primordial public and the civic public. The primordial public is rooted in indigenous traditions and communal affiliation, commanding personal loyalty and moral obligation. In contrast, the civic public is associated with the colonial state and its institutions perceived as alien and lacking moral legitimacy. As a result, individuals often feel justified in exploiting the civic public for personal gain, leading to widespread corruption. Ekeh's analysis suggests that the disconnect between these two publics fosters an environment where civil servants do not view government services as their own, but rather as entities to be utilized for personal or communal benefits. And now, for a very long time, I have been convinced by this theoretical position that the legacy of colonialism has created a dual publics, and public servants in Africa do not see public service as their own. But Bright Seymour has given me a pause with his concept of Katanomy, where he argues that the policy space in most African countries is dysfunctional, and it's not necessarily as a result of the individual graft per se of politicians. He makes this argument in light of the recent call by Oral to recover all loot of previous government officials, and he uses the Palugu Dam as a test case. So essentially, Bryce Simmons is saying that we should actually pause, right? We shouldn't have our hopes too high about the outcomes of Oral, given the dysfunctional nature of our policymaking process. Bright, do I capture your sentiments in a nutshell?
Yes, up to a very elaborate extent, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to assess my position and the effort that you've made to encapsulate it in as few words as possible. One, there is definitely a lot to learn about Africa's challenges in building a modern democratic state and the relation to the primordialism that Ekeh describes. But I think that over the years, in the almost 5 decades since he wrote The Two Publics, there has been, to my mind, an evolution of certain trends. I think there are many African countries which do not have the same degree of ethnic, shall I say, allegiances that he describes, that nonetheless still suffer from some of the dysfunctions that worry us. And a very good example will be Tanzania, which I'm sure you are aware, because of the work of the the Mwalimu, there is far less affiliation to ethnic allegiances compared to some other African countries. Okay. And I'll say that even in Ghana, over the years, we've seen a growing community of detribalized Ghanaians who constitute very large segments of our political public, who are not necessarily driven by primordial connections to their ethnic base. And yet still, notwithstanding this, we do have very significant degree of dysfunction in our policy space, which obviously I will elaborate in a moment.
Okay.
Second, You are right that I have a certain degree of apprehension about the gap between the very high level of expectation that the general public have in terms of the ability to hold accountable the government that just exited and the incoming government's capacity to move beyond that to recover very large amounts of money. I want to distinguish between accountability as a virtue in and of itself and the ability to hold to account particularly high-level government functionaries. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, my primary concern about waste, specifically fiscal waste in the administration of this country and the impact that it has on our economic fortunes. My belief is that corruption is primarily a symptom rather than the cause of many of our problems. And to my mind, the primary reason why corruption abounds in Ghana is due to our inability to implement monitoring and evaluation that is tied to performance. Because a lot of the kinds of corruption we see is bound up with massive failures of policy. So in essence, if you take a country like Italy, you take a country like Romania, you take a country like Bulgaria, even Russia to a very large extent, you do see very large-scale corruption incidents that threatens any notion of accountability. So if accountability was your only premise, then there are a lot of countries around the world, including, of course, Greece, Portugal, and others, where objectively, when you measure corruption, you find out that there are very significant extent of corruption. There's more money to steal anyway. These are richer countries. But my view is that the difference between the corruption there and the corruption in our parts of the world is that quite often you don't see the degree of waste that we see here as a consequence of corruption, in which case I theorize that the corruption effect is less pernicious than what we see. So essentially, in simple terms, what I'm trying to explain is that there are a lot of countries in the world where we have large-scale corruption, similar to what you see in Africa. But often the corruption can be seen as attempts by agents of the state, in this case, politicians who are agents of the state. And the principal agent problem that we understand very well in economics is pervasive to the point where obviously we didn't theorize that notion. It was theorized in the West. So that already tells you that it's very well understood that if a principal, which in this case citizens, give power to an agent, we delegate our power to an agent, the likelihood that our interest will diverge and the agent will attempt to circumvent our interest is there. It's always been there. So it's the nature of human organization that if the citizenry delegates responsibility to politicians, they will have interests that are not always aligned with us, and they will do the best they can to advance it. The difference, I think, though, in the kind of principal agent problems we see in the West and what we see here, is that in the West, because monitoring and evaluation is relatively firm, a politician must still deliver.
Okay.
My argument is that because a politician must still deliver, the level of waste that results from corruption tends to be less. And there are three quick ways in which, to my mind, our problem has compounded. One is that we have a lot of instances where corruption is the reason why the policy is designed in the first place. And therefore, projects are designed purely because of kickbacks and purely because politicians can make money from it. That's one. So essentially, your ability to design programs and projects purely because you will benefit as a politician is heightened in environments like ours, where monitoring and evaluation is very weak. The second is that even when programs and policies are designed properly, in the course of implementation, you are able to divert a lot of funds through contract inflation, through buying things that you're not supposed to buy, and through not buying what you are supposed to buy, leading to almost a level of certainty about project failure that doesn't exist elsewhere. So essentially, disorganized projects designed because you are more concerned about the money you will make, and which therefore leads to almost a certain assurance that the project will fail, and therefore all the money spent on the project will fail.
Yeah. So
and
if I'm getting you, yeah, I just wanted to clarify something. If I'm getting you right, what you're saying is that in the West, the corruption that takes place is solely as a result of lack of virtue, whereas in our case, the corruption is sort of intertwined with the dysfunctional policy space.
Okay. What I'm saying is that in the West, there is a notion of principal agent problems that is well understood and which is of global significance.
Okay.
So everywhere you go in the world, so long as it's human beings creating an organization, if you delegate power to someone, they will abuse some of the power.
Yes.
The human phenomenon. And anytime you create an organization in which the people that are supposed to benefit from something don't have all the power to make sure that the thing is being done in their interest because they've delegated that power, the person to whom that power is delegated will abuse some of that power.
Yes.
And so every time you create any kind of system, there will be corruption. I'm arguing that the corruption, therefore, is an effect of fundamental structures of human organization. You can't do much about it. There will always be corruption. I'm also arguing that scale matters. The amount of corruption matters. And thirdly, I'm arguing that because corruption in my world is incidental, whatever it is that it is incidental to matters more than the corruption. So essentially, if the goal is to create an America that is the most powerful in the world, and it leads to a military budget of 1.1 trillion, a significant amount of that money will be wasted.
Okay.
But if in the course of the America deploying that $1.1 trillion in the service of its objective of becoming the most powerful military in the world, it also doesn't become the most powerful military in the world.
Okay.
And there is widespread failure of all the components of that strategy. Aircraft carriers are not built. If aircraft carriers are built, they sink. Stealth fighters that will make American planes hard to drop are failing all over the place. And America is losing wars all over the place. Then we don't just have corruption. We have massive waste beyond corruption.
Okay.
So take the very classic example of the 10%. And let's assume that it's even 20%. My argument is that we often spend so much time on the 20% that is lost and forget that in some instances, the 80% doesn't even get deployed. So to me, corruption is a consequence and sometimes a side effect of bigger problems in a policy environment.
Okay. So in effect, our concern should be the proper functioning and efficiency of the policy-making process. And to some extent, yes.
Our concern should be both.
Okay.
We should be concerned about corruption in and of itself because, one, like you rightly said, it's the reverse of virtue. And society should, I'm one of those people that, I'm Aristotelian to a certain point. So I believe that virtue in itself is important. So a society should promote virtue. So promoting politicians who don't steal is useful in its own right. But I'm arguing that focusing on the 20% that gets stolen without understanding the 80% that makes the 20% possible is misguided.
Okay.
And in that sense, therefore, virtue is important among our politicians because we should have national values. But we should also critically be concerned about those projects that don't get managed well, which lead to corruption opportunities.
Okay.
Is that clearer?
Yeah, that's clear. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So Bill